There was a time when the sky belonged to giants. Massive, silent, elegant, the airships of the early 20th century glided across continents with a grace modern aircraft can't match. They didn't need massive airports, loud engines, or endless runways. They lifted off vertically, hovered over cities, and crossed oceans in peaceful silence. In their golden age, airships were seen as the future, not science fiction, but the next logical step in aviation. So why did they disappear? Today, the story we're told is simple. The Hindenburg exploded, killing 36 people and destroying public trust. Case closed. Move on. But the truth, some say, is far more disturbing. What if airships didn't vanish because they failed, but because they worked too well? What if their silence, efficiency, and independence threatened the growing power of oil companies, military contractors, and governments that were just beginning to realize the control they could exert through aviation? You see, airships offered something terrifying to those in power: freedom. The ability to move across borders without dependence on fuel pipelines, airports, or government permission. They were too good, and that made them dangerous. This is the story of how one of humanity's most promising technologies was not just forgotten, but deliberately buried. And once you understand what was lost, you'll start to question what else we were never meant to have. To understand the depth of this mystery, we need to look back at what airships truly were. Unlike airplanes, which require speed, runways, and constant thrust, airships floated, held aloft by gases lighter than air. Hydrogen, and later helium, gave them buoyancy. Engines were used not for lift, but for gentle propulsion and navigation. This meant they could travel long distances without massive fuel consumption. By the 1920s and 30s, companies like Germany's Zeppelin were at the forefront of this technology. The Graf Zeppelin, launched in 1928, became a symbol of engineering excellence. It flew from Germany to Brazil, Japan, and even circumnavigated the globe, logging over 1 million miles without a single passenger death. It was a floating hotel, luxurious, stable, and quiet. Newspapers praised it. Passengers described the view from the sky as poetic, an air cruise rather than a flight. But the technology wasn't just for the elite. Cargo airships were envisioned that could deliver goods to remote areas without roads or rails. In military use, they could remain in the air for days, patrolling coastlines or serving as surveillance platforms. Even early ideas of flying cities began to circulate. The world was on the verge of a revolution in the skies. But something, or someone, stopped it. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who questions more than most. So why not join us? Hit the like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. The skies may be silent now, but the truth is still out there. On May 6, 1937, the German airship LZ-129 Hindenburg approached its landing tower in Lakehurst, New Jersey. It was the pride of Nazi engineering, over 800 feet long, capable of transatlantic flight, and filled with highly flammable hydrogen. As it prepared to dock, flames erupted from the rear, and within 30 seconds, the entire ship was engulfed. 36 people died. The world was horrified. But here's what most people don't know. The Hindenburg wasn't the first hydrogen-filled airship to fly, and it certainly wasn't the first to land safely. In fact, it had already completed dozens of transatlantic trips without incident. So why this sudden catastrophe at the peak of its success? The official narrative claims that static electricity or a spark ignited leaking hydrogen, but multiple engineers and historians have questioned this explanation. Some claim the fire started in the rear, far from the gas cells, possibly due to sabotage or an onboard device. And why was the explosion so well documented? American newsreel crews just happened to be on site, filming the landing in full. The footage became legendary, not because of its rarity, but because it was the only disaster ever captured in such dramatic detail. It shocked the world and instantly ended public trust in airships. To this day, some believe the Hindenburg was sacrificed intentionally, not for war, but for economic control, to kill the future of a transportation system that didn't rely on oil, runways, or corporate monopolies. Because when fear replaces vision, innovation dies. After the Hindenburg disaster, airships vanished almost overnight. Governments canceled funding, private investors pulled out, and media outlets, once full of praise, declared the technology unsafe, unreliable, and obsolete. But was that reaction proportional or orchestrated? Let's look at who stood to lose the most if airships had become the dominant mode of air transport. First, the oil industry. Airships didn't need constant fuel to stay aloft. They floated. Compare that to airplanes, which burn vast amounts of oil every second of flight. If a global transport system ran on lighter-than-air gases, oil demand would plummet, threatening the rise of Rockefeller-style empires built on black gold. Second, military-industrial powers. Airplanes are fast, but airships are persistent. They can hover for days, even weeks, perfect for surveillance, border patrol, or disaster relief. But their very independence made them hard to militarize. Worse, they could give civilians too much freedom, flying over borders, operating from anywhere, outside centralized control. Third, the aviation lobby just taking shape in the 1930s. Boeing, Douglas, and other early aircraft manufacturers lobbied governments to fund airstrips, military jets, and commercial planes. They needed the skies to themselves, and airships, slow but elegant, were a threat to their profit model. Add to that media manipulation, and you get a perfect recipe. Take one high-profile disaster, amplify fear, and wipe the slate clean. Airships didn't die because they failed. They were killed by industries that couldn't control them. Imagine a world where cities float, where cargo arrives without roads, where transportation doesn't burn fuel but drifts silently across the sky. That world was possible. In the 1930s, engineers dreamed of airborne hospitals, sky cruise liners, and remote delivery fleets, all using airships. These crafts could land in jungles, deserts, mountaintops, anywhere. No need for airports, highways, or infrastructure. Disaster relief? An airship could carry tons of supplies and hover over disaster zones for days. Telecommunications? Airships could function as floating signal towers, providing internet and radio across entire continents. Energy? With solar panels mounted on top, they could serve as mobile power stations in developing regions. And here's the most radical idea: airborne cities. Engineers in Germany and the US had serious proposals for habitable zeppelins, self-sustaining platforms that could cruise the skies indefinitely, powered by sun and wind. A civilization, mobile and free, rising above borders, nations, and land-based limitations. But none of it happened. Instead, we doubled down on polluting jets, massive airports, congested traffic, and fuel dependency. Or why? Because airships offered something dangerous: decentralization. In a world where control depends on borders, fuel supply chains, and physical infrastructure, the idea of an airship society, off-grid and in the sky, was unacceptable. It wasn't just about safety. It was about keeping us grounded, literally. If airships were truly obsolete, then why do so many attempts to revive them end in failure? Not technical failure, but political and financial sabotage. In the last 30 years, there have been dozens of modern airship projects promising to revolutionize cargo transport, tourism, even surveillance. Some had military contracts, others were green tech startups, but nearly all of them were either mysteriously defunded, quietly shut down, or absorbed by larger corporations and shelved. Let's take a few examples. In the early 2000s, Cargo Lifter AG, a German company, raised hundreds of millions to build massive cargo airships capable of transporting industrial equipment to remote locations. They even built a giant hangar, now repurposed as a water park. The company? Be bankrupted and erased. In the U.S., DARPA and Lockheed Martin both funded hybrid airship research for battlefield surveillance and long-term flight platforms. Prototypes were built. Tests were successful. But then, silence. Even Google's co-founder Sergey Brin reportedly began work on a private luxury airship in the 2010s. Initial renders and reports suggested a massive solar-powered craft. Today, the project is invisible to the public. So what's going on? Are these ideas really impractical? Or are they disappearing for a reason? Many believe that any truly independent low-fuel air transport system threatens the foundations of energy, military, and infrastructure empires. In other words, if it floats too well, it sinks. The pattern is hard to ignore. Let's go back once more to the Hindenburg. What if it wasn't just a tragic accident, but a planned message? A high-profile catastrophe engineered not to kill people, but to kill an idea. Several engineers, historians, and independent investigators have pointed out oddities in the disaster. For example, survivor accounts describe a flash or small explosion before the fire began. The flames ignited in the rear, not where gas cells were most vulnerable, but where radio equipment and storage areas were located. The ship had just completed a transatlantic journey. Why would hydrogen suddenly leak during docking, the slowest, safest part of flight? Oh, some believe a device was planted, small, simple, and timed. Others point to a possible radio spark interference. Unlikely, but convenient. Here's what's more suspicious. Within 48 hours, global media declared the end of the airship age. Editorials, headlines, and government statements all pushed the same narrative, as if the story had already been written. The German government, which had heavily invested in the Zeppelin program, never rebuilt a ship of that class again. Insurance claims were fast-tracked, and just like that, the skies were cleared. There was no multi-year investigation, no push for improved safety, just silence. Compare that to plane crashes, which often lead to redesigns, reform, and improved models. The Hindenburg? It was erased, as if it had never been part of aviation's future. Ask yourself, when else in history has a single accident shut down an entire global technology overnight? By the late 1930s, airships had proven their worth. They had crossed oceans, delivered cargo, carried passengers in comfort, and inspired awe across the globe. But then came World War II, and with it, a seismic shift in how the skies were used. War doesn't favor elegance. It favors speed, force, and control. Airplanes, though less efficient, could dive, dogfight, bomb, and escape. Airships couldn't compete, not because they lacked value, but because they weren't tactically aggressive. They were designed for peace. But here's the twist. Early in the war, the U.S. Navy actually used airships for coastal patrols. They detected submarines, escorted convoys, and spotted threats from miles away. Their ability to hover made them ideal for surveillance. In fact, during World War II, no convoy escorted by a U.S. Navy airship was ever sunk. So why didn't they survive the war? Because the post-war world wasn't built around utility. It was built around oil and dominance. The global aviation industry, turbocharged by war production, had become a cornerstone of economic power. Boeing, Lockheed, and others now had government contracts and factories ready to pivot to commercial aircraft. The oil industry had fueled the war and wasn't about to give up its grip on peacetime. Airships. They didn't fit the narrative. Too slow, too large, too peaceful. By 1945, they weren't just outdated, they were ideologically incompatible with the world being built, a world of speed, surveillance, and control. So the post-war sky was claimed by jets, and the airship became a relic. Not because it failed, but because war had no room for gentle giants. Here's a question no one's asking. If airships are obsolete, why are governments still quietly using them? The truth is, they never fully disappeared. They just became classified. In recent decades, military and intelligence agencies have shown renewed interest in airships for one key reason: persistent surveillance. Unlike satellites, which orbit, or drones, which must land, an airship can hover silently for days or even weeks, scanning entire regions without detection. The U.S. Army and Department of Homeland Security have tested tethered surveillance blimps along the southern border. DARPA has invested in high-altitude airships designed to float in the stratosphere, tracking targets from space. China has launched its own stratospheric spy balloons, and some believe that's just the tip of the iceberg. In logistics, airships could transform remote cargo delivery. Need to transport heavy supplies to a disaster zone with no roads? An airship can do it. But instead of encouraging this innovation, governments stall progress, citing cost, regulation, or lack of interest. Privately, though, aerospace giants like Lockheed Martin have prototypes that can carry 20 tons of cargo with a fraction of the fuel a jet needs. So why isn't this public knowledge? Because airships defy centralization. They don't need airports. They don't need fuel lines. They can take off from anywhere and operate off-grid. Well, that's dangerous, not to safety, but to systems built on control, infrastructure, and profit. In other words, the same forces that buried the airship in the 1930s are still doing it today. In the 1920s and 30s, some of the boldest visionaries imagined a radical future: cities in the sky. These weren't fantasy. Engineers and futurists proposed enormous airships equipped with living quarters, greenhouses, solar panels, and propulsion systems that would allow them to drift across the globe for months, even years, without landing. Self-sustaining, borderless, independent. These flying cities would not be tied to any one nation or government. They wouldn't need roads, ports, or fuel pipelines. They'd float above the rules, literally. Now ask yourself, for those in power who rely on land-based taxation, surveillance, regulation, and borders, what could be more terrifying? A population that can live off-grid is one thing. A population that can move through the sky, free of infrastructure, is another level entirely. Such a civilization would be untraceable, untouchable, and possibly unstoppable. Even in recent years, whispers of such ideas have surfaced. Elon Musk once joked about airships as homes. Google's Loon project launched high-altitude balloons to bring internet to remote areas, but it was abruptly canceled. Independent researchers have designed blueprints for solar dirigibles that could house dozens. Each time, the public hears about it briefly, and then the idea disappears. Why? Because the ultimate danger isn't the technology, it's what it represents. A breakaway society. A community not dependent on fossil fuels, roads, banks, or even land itself. A civilization that can literally rise above the system. And for the modern world order, that's not just inconvenient. It's unacceptable. One of the biggest lies ever sold to the public is that airships were impractical, too slow, too weak, too dangerous. But the truth? The science was never the problem. Let's break down the myths. Airships are unsafe. The Hindenburg burned because it used hydrogen, a flammable gas. But so did every airship before it, many of which flew millions of miles safely. Today, we have helium, non-flammable, stable, and abundant. Planes crash far more often than airships ever did, yet aviation continued. They're too slow. Compared to jets? Yes, but speed isn't always the goal. For cargo, surveillance, tourism, or communications, slow and stable is ideal. Not every flight needs to be fast. Some need to be efficient, quiet, and long-lasting. They can't carry enough. Wrong. Modern prototypes like Lockheed's LMH-1 are designed to carry up to 20 tons of cargo. Massive, rigid frame designs could carry far more, even equivalent to large cargo planes, without needing airports or fuel runways. They're vulnerable to weather. Every aircraft is vulnerable to weather, but airships can fly above storms, hover, or wait in place. With today's materials and forecasting, they're safer than ever. So if the tech works, and always did, why the constant narrative that airships were a failed experiment? Because it's easier to kill an idea with ridicule than with force. Convince people it's impossible, and they'll stop asking questions. Convince them it's inefficient, and they'll stop dreaming. The truth is, airships were never a technological dead end. They were a threat to industries built on scarcity, not science. When the Hindenburg exploded in 1937, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was the first aviation disaster captured on live film and broadcast globally. The haunting footage, the burning wreckage, the famous phrase, "Oh, the humanity," all became cultural landmarks overnight. But think about this. How many other transportation tragedies have been broadcast with such emotional precision and global reach? Train crashes? Shipwrecks? Plane disasters? Very few, and certainly not with this level of orchestration. So here's the question. Was the Hindenburg disaster merely reported, or was it used? In the days that followed, dozens of newspapers and radio outlets ran coordinated headlines declaring the end of the airship era. Editorials didn't ask for investigations or improvements. Instead, they buried the entire technology. Where was the push for safer helium models? Where were the calls to preserve the successes of the Graf Zeppelin and others? Nowhere. It was as if one accident erased decades of progress overnight. A psychological operation by omission. Media has always shaped perception. In the 1930s, people still believed what they heard on the radio or read in the papers. One unified message could reprogram public opinion instantly. And that's exactly what happened. The idea of majestic floating airships was replaced with images of fire, death, and failure. The future was rewritten in real time. And we've been flying in the shadow of that narrative ever since. So why did we abandon airships? Not because they were unsafe, not because they were impractical, but because they represented something dangerous. Freedom. Freedom from fuel. Freedom from infrastructure. Freedom from control. A vehicle that floats, moves gently, lands anywhere, and consumes almost no energy is more than a machine. It's a symbol of decentralization, of independence, of possibilities that don't require the system. And that, above all, is what made airships unacceptable. In a world built on profit margins, fossil fuels, global surveillance, and regulated borders, a sky full of autonomous, slow-moving, self-sustaining vessels would be a nightmare for those in power. And so they were buried. Not with bullets, but with headlines, not with force, but with fear. We were told they were failures, that they didn't work, that no one wanted them. But none of that was true. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When a technology threatens the foundation of centralized control, it's not debated, it's deleted. And today, in the age of AI, drones, smart cities, and total surveillance, the lesson still matters. What other ideas have we lost? What else have we been told to forget? Airships are a case study, a glimpse into how easily the future can be rewritten, not by accident, but by design.